Okay, so we will begin. So this morning I'm going to be talking about impact comparison. And the name kind of gives that away, I think. It's pretty obvious. You have different things in debate, obviously. You'll end up with a bunch of different scenarios, things like global warming, US hegemony, proliferation, and you need to figure out how we best go about comparing these things and convincing the judge why to care about one versus another. And it's interesting, it's like, why does this whole issue get an entire lecture set aside for itself? We're spending as much time talking about that as you would about the entirety of the counterplan. And I think it's important to think about because impact comparison is really central to what happens in debate. Debate is ultimately engaging in cost-benefit analysis. You have a plan, there's various pros, various cons, there might be multiple going in each direction, and part of what happens in debate, one of the main things that happens in debate ultimately that decides it, is trying to go through and compare the costs and benefits to analyze them and to do some sort of risk assessment. So being effective at risk assessment is an essential part of being effective at winning debates. So how do we go about doing impact comparison? Some of you all who have maybe had some experience with debate before have probably heard there's kind of three main pillars or areas in which we compare impacts. So someone want to raise their hand and Grace.
Well, Mr. T, magnitude, risk, and time frame.
Magnitude, risk, and time frame? Okay, yeah. So magnitude, I apologize in advance, my handwriting is terrible. Time frame, and then risk, or another term is probability, likelihood. So, I mean, logically, this is a pretty reasonable set of things on which to compare. We have how big is the impact? And in traditional debate terms, we assume kind of a utilitarian trying to maximize the most number of lives. So biggest is literally like how many people will die if this terrible catastrophic thing we're talking about happens. Time frame, when will it happen? Will it happen tomorrow? Will it happen in a month? Will it happen in 45 years? Things might be more or less intimidating based on how soon they are. And then finally, how likely it is that that thing actually occurs. How likely is it that nuclear proliferation actually causes war? How likely is it that global warming actually turns our atmosphere into Venus and kills all of us or whatnot? So how does one, within these categories, magnitude, on one level it's just if we had a count, if there was a way to just add up, it's like, well, if the affirmative impact happens, 1,236,424,836 people will die. And if the negative impact happens, 1.1 billion people will die. So the affirmative outweighs by 1.1 billion. It's like, but that doesn't really happen. There's no addition. You'll have something, the affirmative will stand up and say, hey, if we don't improve U.S.-Latin America relations, then we won't be able to solve global warming, and that'll be catastrophic. And the negative will stand up and say, hey, well, you'll end up undermining U.S. primacy, which will cause conflicts. And you have to weigh these things against each other. Primacy, global warming. So I think there's kind of two major ways, I think, about comparing the magnitude of impacts. The first is whether or not one impact is inclusive of the other one. And then the second is just sort of more basically to make some sort of comparative argument about why one conflict or crisis is more important than another. So the first one, it's like, let's say that the affirmative impact is that a crisis will break out and there'll be a war between India and Pakistan. And the negative impact is that the global economy will collapse, which will trigger a new World War III. Well, World War III would probably involve India and Pakistan fighting against each other. If all hell breaks loose, and the global economy is totally collapsed and people are fighting to the death over resources, it's likely that historical tensions are going to be one place where conflict occurs. So you could say that the negative's economy impact is inclusive of the affirmative's impact, that it spans the scope of the same things. The same sort of thing might be true with an impact about hegemony, U.S. primacy. So if U.S. hegemony collapses, there will be conflicts across the globe. Those conflicts include smaller local conflicts. So that's a situation that often comes up when you have one team with a very specific conflict scenario, like there will be a war in Syria, Israel will attack Iran, India will attack Pakistan, China will attack Taiwan, Brazil and Argentina will fight. So there's a bunch of different specific scenarios that might break out, and then there's sort of broader impacts like nuclear proliferation, economy, hegemony. So often it's easier to win that the broader impacts have a larger magnitude than the more narrow specific ones. So what is the second category? What is it to say that something is comparatively bigger? This is often something that you can either just do logically or is even stronger if you have some evidence. So, for example, it's pretty hard to make some sort of comparative argument for something like global warming versus nuclear war. They're both catastrophic. I could try and do something. I could say, I could read some evidence that says that nuclear winter is wrong, that nuclear war actually won't cause extinction, that it'll just, it'll be really bad, obviously, for the people who get hit by nuclear weapons. Like if a nuke lands in a city, everyone in that city is going to die. Millions of people will probably die. But when people say nuclear war causes extinction, they're assuming that nuclear war will change the entire climate of the Earth to the point where it causes extinction. So I could read some evidence that says that won't happen, and then global warming will. So often that's something that needs some evidence. But sometimes you can make just sort of logical arguments about why one is just comparatively bigger than another. So if one team has a war between Russia and China, like some conflict will break out and Russia and China will get into a war, and the other side has a war between India and Pakistan, it's like India, there's a lot of people who live in India and Pakistan. There's even more people who live in the combination of Russia and China. So it's like if a big war broke out, there's larger population centers in one than in the other. So sometimes it's just possible to make comparisons like that. Or, a Syrian civil war just on face seems smaller than Israel launching a nuclear strike against Iran. And just the latter just comparatively seems more threatening. So sometimes it can be logical, but sometimes if you have evidence, then that's even more helpful. If you have evidence about whether or not nuclear war will cause nuclear winter, if you have evidence about whether or not global warming will actually change our entire atmosphere to the point where we can no longer live, or if it'll just be somewhat bad but not catastrophic. So sometimes that's a place where evidence can be a helpful way of doing that. In terms of probability, or I guess time frame is whatever next. Time frame, I think of kind of like two main categories of thinking about this. The first is when we're talking about what I would call systemic impacts. And then the second is a comparison between event-based impacts and structural impacts. So what do I mean when I say systemic impacts? Has anyone heard that particular term before? Yeah, back there.
Well, I've heard of systemic circulation.
So what is that?
Circulation through your whole body.
Okay. So what might I mean in this context when I say something systemic?
Like an impact with a critical impact, I guess.
I mean, maybe. It doesn't necessarily have to be, but often that happens. Joe?
Is it an impact that happens initially and then it happens over a long period of time as well? So it has one thing that happens first and another thing that happens after?
Well, yeah, it's definitely something that happens continually over a period of time. So anything that happens continually over a period of time, something will happen first, but it's something that's happening continually over a period of time. But further.
It involves just an entire system with a bunch of chains that are slowing down or like causing problems.
So it involves a bunch of chains
Yeah.
of events? Yeah. Spreads. Okay, so the term definitely, it can be interpreted a bunch of ways. When I'm saying systemic, I'm talking more about kind of what Joe's talking about. It's something that is ongoing and constantly happening. It's something that's built into the system of society. So for example, when in the demo debate on Saturday, we were talking about human rights violations in Cuba. And Julia said, hey, human rights violations they're more probable because they're happening right now, all the time, constantly. It's not something that might happen down the road. It's not some future prediction that some conflict might break out or something will happen. It's saying, hey, right now, actively and continuously, there will be human rights violations in Cuba. Something like poverty is also a systemic impact. People are in poverty, continue to be in poverty, they're in poverty now. That has various detrimental effects on quality of life, ability to survive, ability to navigate society, etc. So those are both impacts that are constantly happening, repeatedly over time, and are happening now. So by default, they're very, in terms of time frame, they're happening right now. So they're always fast. They're always something that is currently happening that we currently can address. The second category, events versus structural. What I mean by this is an event-based impact is something that has a very specific chain of events that's going to happen. So someone says, hey, if U.S. primacy declines, then China will think that the U.S. won't be able to defend Taiwan. China will try and invade Taiwan. Then that'll actually draw the U.S. in. That'll escalate. We'll have a China-Taiwan war. And the United States will get involved. So that's a very specific event. These steps that have to happen to one particular outcome. China, the U.S. fighting over Taiwan. Something that's structural is something that can sort of influence various conflicts, but it doesn't rely on any one particular scenario. So when we talk about something like hegemony, U.S. primacy, or when we talk about economic decline causing conflict, these are both structural impacts. We say, hey, when the economy declines, people get desperate, they need to fight for resources. That just makes conflict more likely. That could be true anywhere. That could be true between Ethiopia and Eritrea. That could be true between India and Pakistan. That could be true between Germany and Russia. There could be a bunch of different conflicts, and all of those conflicts are made structurally more likely in a world where the economy is declining. Because in a world where the economy is declining, people become desperate to make sure that they can acquire resources for their country, for their economy. Same sort of thing with hegemony. When we say that U.S. hegemony, when there's one really powerful state, it makes other states less likely to start conflicts. They don't want to sort of upset the system because they don't want to challenge the one superpower that could potentially destroy them. So people are less likely to start conflicts. And that's, again, that could be true of a bunch of different scenarios. It might be a reason why Iran wants to hold themselves in check. It might be a reason why China will be hesitant about trying to reintegrate Taiwan. It might be a reason why Venezuela would be hesitant to challenge the United States. So across the board, structurally, a world with U.S. primacy, according to some arguments, would make conflict less likely, that it would just dampen conflict. So in general, situations that have event-based scenarios tend to be faster. Because they tend to have a specific prediction. When I just say something like, hey, hegemony prevents conflict, I'm not saying anything. I've made no specific argument about when a conflict is going to break out, what this situation will be, who these countries are that are going to be fighting each other if U.S. hegemony declines, when it's going to happen, when their incentives are. Because it is a broad structural impact, it tends to be vaguer. I'm not making a very specific claim about, well, on October 31st, China is going to launch the strike. Obviously, no one's really saying anything that specific about like October 31st, but in general, when we're talking about event-based impacts, there tends to be a quicker time frame. You tend to outline a specific scenario for how things will happen, when things will happen, that tends to go quicker. One important thing to note, that when we're talking about time frame in terms of impact comparison, we are not talking about the time frame of the link or the plan's solvency. So one sort of common mistake that I'll hear in a lot of debates is someone will, let's say that we're talking about a politics dissent. It's something that tends to be very time sensitive. So Obama is currently out there trying to negotiate a deal on immigration. He's going to get it done now. And the plan's really controversial and interferes with his ability to get that negotiation done. Well, I'll often hear a team stand up and they'll say, hey, our impact outweighs on time frame because the vote on immigration is coming up in a month and a half. The problem is that the vote on immigration is not your impact. You're not weighing the vote on immigration versus the benefits of solving human rights in Cuba. You're saying that the vote on immigration will have some other consequence. If Obama gets immigration reform, that'll be good for the US economy because it'll bring in more sort of foreign talent and human capital into the United States, and that'll spur economic growth. But that's a very long-term process, people moving into the US, then acquiring jobs, then putting their money back into the economy, that's stimulating things. So that's actually really, really long-term. The actual impact itself has a very long time frame. So keep in mind, when you're talking about the time frame of an impact, when you're trying to do comparison, to keep that separate from when the link will occur. So it's not when is there going to be a vote on immigration, it's not when is the embargo going to get lifted, it's when will that actual impact happen. So the AF might say, hey, we outweigh because we lift the embargo tomorrow. It immediately happens. Sure, but your impact is that if we lift the embargo, that will improve relations with Latin America, and if we improve relations with Latin America, we'll be able to negotiate some deals on climate change, and that will avert catastrophe. And that whole process is very long term. When is climate change going to actually cause catastrophe? It could be 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the road before the worst impacts of that come back. So keep in mind that the time frame of your impact is separate from the link scenario that gets you there. When we're talking about impact comparison, we're really just trying to focus on just the last part of the chain. We have uniqueness, links, internal links, a bunch of different stuff. We get to the impact, just focusing just on that last part and comparing it. So, last category, probability. Ways of comparing the likelihood of different impacts. And again, I'll emphasize, this is different from the probability of the scenario that leads to that impact. So in the demo debate that we watched on Saturday, a lot of folks might have been skeptical or didn't think that the negative won a very big risk of their disadvantage. I think even Jason admitted that in the 2NR. He said that even if he had a 1% chance, you should still vote for him. So he was obviously a little skeptical of how successful his disad would be. That being said, when we're talking about the probability of an impact, his impact was about a global environmental crisis causing resource wars. So when we're talking about probability, we're really talking about how likely do you think it is that a global environmental crisis will cause resource wars? Not how likely do you think it is that the rest of the world is going to model Cuba? You might think that's very unlikely, but that's just a reason why the link to the disad is small. That's not a reason why the impact to the disad is necessarily improbable. There might be other reasons you think the link to the impact is improbable. It might just sound ridiculous on face, the idea that a bunch of countries are going to start launching nuclear weapons at each other because without economic democracy, we will have used up all the water and all of our natural resources. Like, there might be other reasons that this impact seems questionable, that it seems unlikely that people are actually going to be fighting a massive nuclear hellfire over this issue. But that's separate from the question of the link. So, as a sort of just brief aside, why do we keep that separate? That just seems sort of confusing. But it's helpful as a way of trying to resolve the debate. You want to keep these different parts of it separate in order to think better about the debate. So, generally, the probability of the affirmative advantages versus the negative disadvantages, they often won't be that far apart. You'll have a lot of debates that are really close. And there's no way to calculate specific numbers. I can't say, well, the affirmative doesn't solve that much of human rights. We'll say they solve 5% of human rights problems. And it seems pretty unlikely Cuba will get modeled. We'll say that there's a 4% chance. Okay, well, the AF has a bigger impact. 5% is bigger than 4. It would be nice if we could do that, but there's no way of doing it. You might have sort of a general sense of, well, these both seem sort of unlikely. These both seem sort of medium likely. These both seem very likely. And sometimes there'll be situations where one seems very likely and one seems very unlikely. And then there's no real need to do all this. It's just like, well, there's no chance that that's going to happen, and this seems very likely. All of this stuff comes into play in the situations where those probabilities are close. Where it's like, hey, this disad, there's like a reasonable chance of it happening, and there's a reasonable chance of this case happening. And there's maybe a little bit more of one than another, but they're pretty close. So which one should I care more about? And that's when we then look at the impact and say, well, what do I care more about? Human rights or the environment? What do I care more about? Hegemony or the economy? So trying to keep it separate conceptually, because that's how it functions. It functions separately to resolve situations where the link or the solvency for a particular scenario is somewhat close. And it can sometimes sort of create advantages for you even when it's not close. So there might be situations where you have an impact, where you have a disad that's very low probability, and the AF has an advantage that's very high probability in terms of its link. But you can just convince the judge that your impact is so much more important that you should vote for it anyway. So it's an important way of offsetting those situations. So jumping back to probability, what are different ways of comparing probability? I think of kind of three categories here. The first two are the same as these time frame categories, which is systemic impacts, and this time I'll write structural versus event. And then the last category I would call intervening actors. Intervening actors. Probably, I know this is sort of hidden down here, but that last thing says intervening actors. So what do I mean by those? So systemic impacts, we talked about those before. Systemic impacts are faster. They have a quicker time frame because they're happening right now, constantly. The same thing can be said of their probability. Systemic impacts are definitely happening. People are for sure 100% living in poverty. There are people in Cuba who for sure 100% don't have water or medicine. These are things that we don't have to speculate about their likelihood. We don't need to sit around here and say, how likely is it that if this chain of events happens, a conflict will break out? I know it. It's 100%. It might not be bigger. You know, it might seem on face, it's like, well, a lot more people are going to die in a nuclear war than are dying from lack of food and water in Cuba. But that being said, a nuclear war is still an event that has to occur, that has a bunch of chains that lead to it, that all contain different probabilities. People, you know, in Cuba not having food and water, that's not an event. It's not a chain. It's happening right now, 100%. It's likely. It's 100% probable. So systemic impacts are more probable, even if they tend to be smaller. In general, systemic impacts are smaller, but they have a better probability and time frame. So again, I wrote structural versus event, but this time I wrote it the other way around. So it's the same sort of thing I was explaining before. There's those two categories of impacts. Impacts that are based on specific events, specific chains, and then impacts that are structural. And the impacts with specific events tend to be quicker. They'll have a time frame, but they'll also tend to be less likely. A structural impact, sort of by definition, has a higher probability because it's just making an argument that applies in a bunch of different contexts. Now, there's sort of this like human psychological bias of sorts that when something sounds very specific, it sounds more likely. We're like, oh, well, this person has all of this specific stuff. They're not just talking generally about whether or not primacy causes conflict. They have all this very specific scenario about China and Taiwan attacking each other. But actually, you know, the more specific that something is, the less likely it is because it means only that particular outcome can occur for that event to happen. So if I say China and Taiwan will go to war, that statement is only true if China and Taiwan go to war. If I say that a collapse in US primacy will cause conflict, that statement is true if China and Taiwan go to war. That statement is true if India and Pakistan go to war. That statement is true if Iran and Israel go to war. So that statement doesn't rely on one very specific thing happening to be validated. So the probability of one specific chain of events happening is inherently less likely than the probability of any one of a given set of events occurring. So impacts that are broad and structural, like economic decline, US primacy, tend to be higher probability impacts than impacts that are based on very specific events, very specific conflicts. The last category I had written down is intervening actors. And this is sort of an interesting way of framing things. I think it's a way of basically comparing impacts that rely on humans versus impacts that have more to do with the environment. So this is sort of an argument that will come up a fair amount when we're comparing something like global warming to something like US primacy. And basically, the argument is that an impact like a war, any war, be it a nuclear or a conventional war, involves some element of human decision. At some point, there's an individual or group of individuals who needs to press the big shiny red button that says blow up my enemies. And people are, obviously you don't want to be the person who's known in history as a mass murderer for being the one who presses the button. There's always sort of this just general sense of humans trying to avoid conflict. Now, we do it all the time. Humans have not been the most peaceful species over the course of our history. There's been plenty of wars since the beginning of time, since the Peloponnesian Wars and Carthage and all sorts of stuff, all the way through World War I, World War II. So it's not that war is impossible, but there is some element of decision where at the last minute, someone could always back down from the brink. We could get to the point of nuclear war. Like during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we were really, really close to nuclear war. There was a situation where there was a Russian nuclear submarine that was trying to figure out whether or not they were supposed to launch a nuclear torpedo at one of the ships that was part of the US blockade. And that ship was pre-delegated that authority, which means that they didn't have to get authorization from Command Central in Moscow. The commanders on that ship, there were 3 of them, and they could vote. And it was a 2-1 vote in favor of launching the weapon. But the decision had to be unanimous. So if that one Russian general had not decided at the last minute that he didn't want to launch a nuclear weapon, then Russia would have launched nuclear torpedoes at a US ship. And it's possible that that could have escalated to a full-out exchange. But it didn't. But we were really close. But my point is that there's always a chance that when you get right up to the brink, someone can back down. The same is not true of, for example, global warming. Carbon dioxide molecules cannot decide at the last second that they're going to stop changing the atmosphere before they kill humanity. Once we release that stuff, we've released that stuff. There's no coming back from the brink. So it's just an argument that impacts that involve human decision or conflict are less likely than impacts that relate to the environment, because there's always the possibility of kind of a human decision backing things down. But when we're talking about the environment, once we cross certain thresholds, once we've depleted enough of this resource, it's gone. Once we've released enough carbon into the atmosphere, it's there. There's no coming back from it. There's no intervening actor that can come in and save us at the last second. So, these are kind of the three main categories, and most impact comparison revolves around utilizing these 3 categories in some way. And given whatever impact you're going for, you may want to emphasize certain ones more or less than another. It's possible that you have an impact that's really big, but somewhat unlikely. So you want to focus on magnitude. You could have an impact like human rights that's more likely, has a faster time frame, but isn't very big. So we sort of saw that as a very clear example in the demo debate on Saturday. The affirmative was going for an impact that was more probable and faster, but much, much smaller, and spent the first about minute even of the 2AR just making a case for why we should care more about about human rights violations in Cuba than we should about some unlikely prospect of nuclear war. On the flip side, the 2NR spent about the first minute of his speech trying to convince you that even if it was a low probability, that the catastrophic consequences of a nuclear war meant that we had to prioritize his impact over the affirmatives. So both of those rebuttals, both of those final speeches dedicated quite a significant amount of time to the issue of impact comparison. And I feel like, as some of you all tried to think through the process of evaluating the debate, a lot of your decisions may have fallen somewhat along those lines. Were you convinced more by Julia's appeal to a probable crisis, systemic crisis that's happening right now, she sort of tried to get some ethos into it at the beginning, trying to talk about right now there are Cubans who are walking around who can't find water, who are trying to find food for tonight, trying to make that feel very personal. And then there are some of you who might have just been scared off by the fire and brimstone of Jason's 2NR. And wherever you fell on that very strongly influenced how you might have decided. And I think that kind of gives you a sense of how important some of these issues are for resolving debates, that both of those debaters chose to dedicate an important or a significant amount of their time to those issues. So there's one sort of fourth thing that tends to be associated with impact comparison, but it's not one of these three terms. Does anyone know what I might be hinting at? If you are negative, for example, and you're sending a disad, there's always this sort of, after you've done your impact comparison, I say, okay, my impact is bigger, it's more likely, it's quicker, and
Oh, I was going to say framework.
okay, not quite what I'm getting at, but we solve their impact, is what you're getting at? So yeah, and oftentimes we'll call this the disad turns the case, or the disad solves the case. And I basically call it the category of interactions, the ways that the affirmative's impact interacts with the negative's impact, and vice versa. So there's a comparison, this is bigger than that, and then there's an interaction. This can resolve that, this can fix that. So for example, when we were talking about a big impact like US primacy versus a conflict like between India and Pakistan. So when we're talking about magnitude, we could say, well, hegemony is bigger because it's inclusive. An Indo-Pakistan war could just be one example of a conflict that would break out if primacy collapsed. But we could also go further than that and say, well, not only is this just a part of our impact, but that means that we actively solve your impact because US primacy will deter India and Pakistan from ever starting a war in the first place. So as long as we maintain hegemony, that will never happen. Now, may or may not be true, but it is an argument that you could make. So this is true for both sides. The negative can make arguments for why they can turn or solve the affirmative's case, and the affirmative should also make arguments for why they can turn or solve the impact of the disadvantage. So can anyone think of some examples of these types of arguments that happened in the debate on Saturday? Any examples where the negative said that they solved the case, where the affirmative said that their case solved the disad? Yeah.
They didn't really explicitly say that they solved, but they said the next said that if the world's over, we can't solve the human life, so indirectly.
Yeah. So that's one. So that's not, that's an argument for why the disad turns the case or makes it impossible to solve the case. Said, if we're having this big nuclear war going on, we're not going to be able to work with each other on dealing with human rights issues. Yeah.
Neg said that if Cuba gets a democracy, then I don't lift the embargo.
Yeah. So the negative made an argument that if Cuba becomes a democracy, we would no longer have a reason to keep the embargo against them, and we would lift it. So that's very literally a reason why the disad solves the case, will cause it to happen. It's just an issue of sequencing. We don't want to lift the embargo before democracy happens in Cuba, because we'll upset it, but if democracy happens in Cuba, then we'll lift the embargo, so it solves the whole case. Were there any arguments the affirmative made about why they solved or turned the negative's disad? Are there any they could have made that they chose not to, or that they didn't? If they'd gone for their relations advantage, and they talked about global warming, for example, so what did they do with their global warming impact in that debate? They conceded it and they said, well, we can't solve it, but this also means that you can't solve your impact. If global warming is inevitable, then economic democracy is not going to solve the environment. But they could have gone the other direction. If they didn't kick out of that impact, they could say, hey, if we solve global warming, then we solve your impact. We solve environmental crises. But there's a bunch of different ways that you could do this. So the negative said that if we had a nuclear war, we couldn't address human rights. They also said that if democracy emerged in Cuba, that would lead to lifting the embargo. They could have also said that independently of lifting the embargo, if there were a democracy in Cuba, that democracy would be more likely to respect human rights. So that's another argument for why democracy would turn human rights. They could have also said, use their environment impact. Because the premise of their environment impact was that we're going to eat up all of these resources and people are going to be running out of food and water and they'll fight over this stuff. Well, what was the affirmative's claim about human rights? They're saying the reason that people's human rights are being violated in Cuba is they didn't have access to food, water, basic resources. So if the negative impact is true, and there's going to be a massive environmental crisis where the world is running out of important resources like food and water, then for the same reasons the affirmatives claimed, that's also a human rights violation. So my point in kind of going through this is that it's valuable to try and think of as many different ways that your impact can interact with the other as possible. And you can do it on kind of any different level. So the negative could have both used reasons why the democracy solved human rights, used reasons why the terminal endpoint of nuclear war would be bad for human rights, used arguments about just the environment part of their impact, even if there was never a war about it, would still be bad for human rights. They can use all of these different levels, create a bunch of different ways of generating interactions between their impact and the affirmative's impact. And the affirmative can do the same thing. The affirmative could have extended their Latin America relations solvency arguments as a reason why they solved global warming, solved environmental crises. They sort of tried to use their proliferation argument. They said, hey, well, if there's no proliferation, then the ultimate conflict that you're saying will occur will be less devastating because countries won't actually have nuclear weapons. So there's a bunch of different ways that you can generate these interactions between those impacts. And you should try and generate as many as possible. So the next sort of section is how do you compare between these categories? So this is comparisons within these categories. How do I compare the magnitude of one impact versus another impact? How do I compare the probability of one impact versus another impact? But there's a separate question, which is kind of the next level. It's like the first basic thing you got to figure out is just how to do a good job at coming up with magnitude, probability, time frame arguments, coming up with reasons why the disad turns the case or the case turns the disad, getting it all out there. When you have some of that going on, the next step is how do I make comparisons between these? What's more important, magnitude or time frame? What's more important, probability or magnitude? These sort of comparisons honestly don't happen that much. There's just not that many people who really take the time to do this. But when they do, it's awesome. Because if you're the only one doing that, then the judge is going to very much appreciate that you're going to that next level of helping them make their decision. They're stuck here with a situation where the affirmative is saying, hey, we have this impact that's low magnitude but really high probability. And the negative says, well, we have this impact that's low probability but really high magnitude. And the judge is sitting here being like, well, what should I care more about, magnitude or probability? No one's told me. The AF did a really good job talking about why their impact is probable. The neg did a really good job talking about their impact is big. But like in that demo debate, no one really did that much work talking about which one I should care about more. Should I care about the impact that's big, or should I care about the impact that's likely? So going to that next level can be very helpful. So what are some ways of doing it, of being able to make those comparisons? So some reasons why magnitude might outweigh. One, the first kind of major one I think about is what I would call the diamonds are forever theory. And what I mean by that is basically when you have an impact that could get to human extinction and the other team doesn't, it doesn't matter how likely it is, because human extinction means it's done forever, nothing left. So, for example, there's this guy Jonathan Schell, and he was like an anti-nuclear disarm activist during the Cold War. And when he was making his case for why we needed to abolish nuclear weapons and get rid of them, because nuclear weapons created the risk that we could create human extinction. And he sort of outlined this argument that a lot of debaters tend to latch onto, that if human extinction ever happened, not only will all 7 billion people that currently live end up dying, but also every future human who would have ever been born now no longer has the opportunity to be born. So one could say that the impact, the number of people that die if human extinction occurs is infinity, not just 7 billion. Because it's 7 billion plus infinitely however many humans could have been on until the end of time. So generally, when we're trying to compare things, we say that we take, magnitude times probability. I've got 100 people dying, and there's a 2% chance, equals 2. I have, 10 people dying, but there's a 50% chance, equals 5. But if you have infinity, then if you multiply it times anything that's not 0, it's still infinity. So even if there's only a point 0.000000000000000000001% chance of an impact that causes human extinction, 0.00001% of infinity is still infinity. So that's a case that one could make for why magnitude is more important than probability if your impact gets to extinction. Another sort of, the second sort of category of magnitude outweighs arguments is what I would call try or die. Again, these are just so uplifting. So the try or die argument, it's more often something that the affirmative gets to say rather than the negative. But basically it happens in a situation where the other team has not contested the uniqueness or impact to your case, but is only going for solvency. And basically you're just saying, hey, even if there's a very low chance that we solve this problem, like global warming. So let's say I'm affirmative. I say, hey, we need to improve U.S.-Latin America relations to solve global warming. Global warming, it's happening right now, and it's going to kill all of us. And the other team stands up, and they say, well, you're not going to solve global warming. There's all these problems. China and India are never going to get on board. Growth incentives are just too built into our system. There's already too much stuff in the atmosphere. There's just no chance. But they don't say anything about why global warming wouldn't be bad, why it wouldn't kill us all. They don't say anything about why global warming's not happening now. They're just saying that it's very, very improbable that I can address it. Well, we say, well, it doesn't matter, because if there's going to be this massive impact that's happening right now, then even if there's only the tiniest chance that we can solve it, we have to try, because the alternative is that we'll die. So we try or die. Because if you vote negative, they don't have any reason for why that global warming won't occur right now or won't cause extinction. They've just said that you're very unlikely to solve it. So this is kind of another way of kind of doing the same thing, of saying, hey, if we have a really, really big impact, then even if you think it's somewhat unlikely that we can solve it, we have to try, because the alternative is we're all dead and might as well go down fighting. In terms of time frame, some arguments, a couple different ways that you can say time frame is most important. The first is I would call live to fight another day. This one, again, kind of seems somewhat self-evident. If my impact happens really soon, and their impact happens far down the road, then even if their impact is bigger than my impact, we should still try and fix mine first. Because it's happening right now. It'll happen very soon. And we need to fix that problem so that we can live to fight another day. So that we can live to deal with their impact somewhere down the road. So for example, if they have a global warming impact, and I'm saying, hey, well, there will be an Indo-Pakistan war. And it will happen very soon. A conflict is going to break out in the next year. Global warming, it's bigger. I'm more worried about global warming. It affects the whole planet. It could potentially kill everyone. An India-Pakistan war would be bad, but it's still isolated. It's regional. But an India-Pakistan war is much faster. I'm claiming it's going to happen very soon. Global warming, it might not happen until 20, 30 years down the road. So we're saying, hey, well, if we prevent this India-Pakistan war now, then we'll have time 20, 30 years down the road. If we live to fight another day, we can deal with global warming later. So we should prioritize dealing with impacts that are happening fast so we can get through them and live to fight against their impacts another day. Another sort of similar way of framing that is again to refer to intervening actors. The further away an impact is, the further down the road it is, the more likely it is that someone or something will step in between now and then to make it not happen. So if I say, hey, I could have some really obscure, weird, goofy impact, like the world is running out of phosphorus, and we need phosphorus to grow crops. So if we run out of phosphorus, then we'll just all die because we won't be able to make food anymore. But we might not run out of phosphorus for, my evidence says, like 100 years. So it seems pretty likely that at some time in the next 100 years, we'll figure out some way to grow enough food without phosphorus. There's enough time, because the impact is so far away, that some intervening actor might be able to step in and resolve it. But if my impact is really soon, then there's just a lot less time for anyone to step in and fix that problem. You could kind of make the same case with global warming. You could say, hey, global warming is really far down the road. You should prioritize some faster, more recent, more short time frame impact, because there will be time for intervening actors to deal with, to come up with ways to get us out of the global warming problem down the road. I mean, you could also go the other way and say, hey, that means we'll never do anything about global warming. This is what people have been saying since the 80s, and kind of cut back the other way. But the intervening actors is one way of framing why impacts that are short time frame are more probable. The further away an impact is, the less likely it is, according to that argument. So that's a case you could make for why time frame is more important. So arguments you could make for why probability is most important. One is I would call the 1% or Cheney doctrine. So basically, there was some point where Dick Cheney, who has a very appropriate first name, was being asked, sort of, well, why did we need to go into Iraq and Afghanistan and all this stuff after 9/11? And he was basically like, well, even if there's only a 1% chance that terrorism is going to occur, it's so catastrophic that we need to do everything we can to prevent it, including the Patriot Act, forfeiting all of our securities and privacy and whatever. Like, whatever, we got to, even if there's only a 1% chance. So scared. So that's basically what they're saying up here. So this is like the flip side to this argument. When they stand up and say, hey, even if there's only a 1% chance, we should still work to avoid that, because 1% of infinity is still infinity, and we just need to prevent this catastrophic impact at all costs, no matter what. And you can come up and you can say, hey, you sound a lot like Dick Cheney. That's probably not a good way of making decisions, because it means that we'll end up forfeiting things that are more important in the name of some unlikely possible crisis down the road. So, especially if you're talking about some sort of systemic high probability impact. If your impact is something like human rights or poverty, and they stand up and they say, oh, there's going to be a nuclear war that's going to kill us all, even if it's unlikely, we need to care about it because it's more important, it's just so much bigger. And you say, hey, and this is kind of what Julia was trying to do, or started to get at some of these arguments in that demo debate on Saturday. And she was saying, hey, well, if we're constantly just freaking out about a 1% chance of a nuclear war blowing up, then we're never going to do anything to fix these people's lives in Cuba, to help them out, to improve their lives, to get them out of poverty, to get them food, get them water, etc. Because there's always, you can always create some infinitesimally small chance. There's something called the butterfly effect, which is just like, if I hit this here, there's some imperceptibly small series of changes that happens throughout the world that eventually means that a monsoon happens in India, or something crazy or whatever. It's like there's imperceptibly small ripple effects between everything in the world. So one could basically always make the case that there's like a 0.001% chance of something catastrophic happening no matter what you do. Like, there could be some person who's starving on the side of the road, and I offer them a granola bar, and my friend says, hold on, don't offer them that granola bar. There's a 1% chance that that person is actually a reincarnation of Hitler, and if you feed them, they will then start the second Holocaust, so you need to let them die. It's like you can always create some incredibly unlikely, tiny justification to prevent you from doing anything helpful, ever. Because it's imperceptibly small. It could just be, well, if you hand him that granola bar, there's a 0.01% chance that somehow this will cause a karmic ripple effect through the universe that will mean that the moon will explode. It's like, I don't know, it's like imperceptibly small, but 0.1% chance of infinity is still infinity, so don't worry about it. So this is basically just the way of trying to do the opposite of this. When someone else has a bigger impact and you have a very probable impact, you want to make them sound like Dick Cheney. So, I mean, and this is kind of the general sense of there's some times when you're going to have an impact that is faster. So you're going to want to emphasize why we should care about time frame, things that are sooner or more likely, things that are further away or less likely. There'll be times when you have an impact that's bigger and you want to try and be Dick Cheney. And there's times when you have an impact that's smaller, but it's very likely, and you want to try and emphasize why probability is more important. So basically, you want to try and figure out where you're ahead. What part of this impact calculus triad, these three pillars of magnitude, probability, and time frame, am I doing the best on? And then try and emphasize why that one is most important. And there's a variety of different ways to do that. These are kind of the main examples that I like to think about, but as you kind of get further and further into your career, you'll start figuring out more ways that you like to make these comparisons, or how you like to word them, how you like to make the case. You kind of want to give it your own gusto. Because these are kind of things you just get to grandstand about a little bit. You get to kind of stand up and do a little bit of 30 seconds of good old-fashioned Winston Churchill public speaking and just really, get into it. Try and convince someone of something. Try and really sell a case. And that's something you kind of want to learn to do with these sort of things. One last just quick piece of advice before I give you all a break before the second lecture. You'll face the same number of impacts, see the same general set of impacts over and over in debate. You'll see a bunch of different global warming or environment type impacts. You'll see a bunch of hegemony type impacts. You'll see a bunch of economy type impacts. You'll see a bunch of specific conflict scenarios, China, Taiwan, Iran, Israel. You'll see a bunch of systemic impacts, poverty, human rights, etc. So you can kind of think through in advance how you want to go about comparing these different categories. Go home and write up, hey, if I were trying to say that a hegemony impact outweighs a global warming impact, what would I say? Magnitude, time frame, probability turns the case. What would I say? And try and think through how you would do that. And that same situation will end up happening numerous times over the course of your career, where you'll be in a debate, and lo and behold, you're saying a hegemony impact, the other team's got a global warming impact, and you've already thought through how you want to do that comparison. The same sort of thing is true. How do you want to make the comparison when you're the one talking about a systemic impact like human rights and trying to say that that outweighs a big nuclear war? How do you want to say things when you're the one trying to defend that a big nuclear war outweighs the systemic impact like human rights? You'll be on either side of that debate numerous times over the course of your career. So you can take some time, whenever you're preparing for debates, preparing for tournaments, or just sitting around bored thinking about debate, like I'm sure all of you do all the time, just like me, and just kind of think through those things in advance so that when it comes up in a debate, you've already sort of prepared for it. Because it's something that will happen so many times and it won't change from topic to topic. You'll see these things over and over. So if you do it once, it's an investment that'll end up reaping benefits numerous times over. All right, take 5 minutes and then come back for lecture number 2. Oh, just in time.
Waiting outside.
I could probably get results of Emory, but print it out previously.
We still recording?
It's still rolling, yeah.